slavery, a cry for freedom, and a God who raises an unlikely hero. In the ancient land of Egypt, a powerful dynasty thrived on the backs of a suffering people, the Israelites. Enslaved for generations, they toiled under the searing sun, building monuments to Pharaoh's glory while their own cries for deliverance echoed into the heavens. Pharaoh's grip on the Israelites was ironclad, his resolve fueled by fear of their growing numbers. They were a nation without land, hope, or a future, or so it seemed. Yet, amid this bleak oppression, hope would arise from the most unexpected place, a tiny basket drifting along the Nile. This is where the story of Moses begins, a tale not just of one man, but of the unshakable faith of a people, and the enduring promise of a God who hears the cries of the oppressed. The story begins during a time of unimaginable despair. Pharaoh, threatened by the sheer number of Israelites, decreed that every Hebrew boy born would be thrown into the river. It was a decree of cruelty, a desperate attempt to crush the spirit of a people. But one woman, armed with courage and faith, defied this edict. Jochebed, a Hebrew mother, placed her infant son in a reed basket, entrusting him to God's care as she released him into the Nile's currents. With a prayer on her lips and tears in her eyes, she let go, believing that somehow God had a plan. And there, a miracle occurred. Pharaoh's daughter, bathing along the riverbank, discovered the child. Struck by his beauty and innocence, she took him in as her own, naming him Moses, meaning drawn out of the water. Little did she know, this child born into obscurity would grow up to challenge the might of Egypt's throne and lead an entire nation to freedom. Raised in the luxury of Pharaoh's court, Moses might have seemed destined for a life of comfort and privilege, but God had other plans. As the years passed, Moses began to sense the call of his true identity. Torn between the life he had known and the suffering of his people, he would make a choice that would set the stage for one of the most dramatic stories in human history. But the story of Moses is more than one of daring escapes and miraculous victories. It's a story about faith in the unseen, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and the transformative power of answering a divine call. Moses' journey, from an abandoned baby to the leader of a liberated people, is a testament to what happens when ordinary lives intersect with an extraordinary God. What does it take to change the course of history? Moses' life answers this question with one profound truth. It begins with a willingness to say yes. It begins with faith, even when the odds are against you, and perseverance, even when the path ahead seems impossible. This is not just the story of Moses, but of the God who calls us to step out of our comfort zones and into the unknown. It's the story of how one man's obedience transformed the destiny of millions and revealed the heart of a God who delivers. Stay tuned as we explore the incredible events that shaped Moses into a leader, a prophet, and a man whose legacy continues to inspire millions. Sometimes the path to greatness begins in the most unexpected places. In the grand halls of Pharaoh's palace, amidst the wealth and power of ancient Egypt, a child of Hebrew descent was being raised as a prince. Moses was given every advantage Egypt could offer: education, military training, and the lifestyle of the elite. Yet, as the years passed, whispers of his origins began to tug at his heart. Who was he really? Was he an Egyptian prince? Or did his heart belong to the Hebrew slaves who cried out to God for deliverance? This is where Moses' journey to leadership begins, not in triumph, but in conflict. Moses' upbringing in Pharaoh's court, Exodus 2:10 recounts, "When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because, she said, I drew him out of the water." Imagine the irony. The very child Pharaoh's decree sought to destroy was now being nurtured under his roof, raised as royalty. While Pharaoh was determined to subjugate the Israelites, God had a plan to raise up a deliverer in his own household. Moses' early years were spent learning the ways of the Egyptians, According to Acts 7:22, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. He would have studied leadership, strategy, and the art of governance. Yet despite this life of privilege, Moses' heart was never truly at rest. Hebrews 11:24-25 reveals, "By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin." Moses' connection to his Hebrew heritage could not be severed. As Moses reached adulthood, his internal conflict grew. According to Acts 7:23, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He witnessed their harsh treatment firsthand. The grandeur of Pharaoh's court could no longer blind him to the suffering of his people. Imagine the scene: Moses, dressed in royal garments, walking among the enslaved Hebrews. Every whip crack, every anguished cry reminded him that he could no longer ignore his identity. The question gnawed at him: what could he do to help his people? One day Moses' turmoil reached a breaking point. Exodus 2:11-12 narrates, "One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." Moses believed he was acting as a deliverer, but his actions were driven by human anger rather than divine direction. The next day, when he attempted to mediate a dispute between two Hebrews, one of them retorted, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Exodus 2:14. In that moment, Moses realized his secret was out. Pharaoh would soon hear of the murder, and Moses' life would be in danger. The turning point: Moses flees to Midian. Exodus 2:15 tells us, "When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian." Moses left Egypt behind, not just physically, but emotionally. He was a man without a country, alienated from the Hebrews and exiled from the Egyptians. In Midian, Moses' life took a dramatically different turn. From the grandeur of a palace to the simplicity of a shepherd's life, Moses began to learn humility. He found refuge with Jethro, the priest of Midian, and married his daughter Zipporah. For 40 years, Moses tended sheep in the wilderness, his royal upbringing seemingly forgotten. Yet these years in Midian were not wasted. God was shaping Moses, teaching him patience and perseverance. Shepherding flocks in the harsh desert would prepare him for the task of leading a nation through similar terrain. As Isaiah 55:8-9 reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." God's plan for Moses was unfolding, even when it seemed like nothing was happening. The burning bush, a divine encounter. At the age of 80, Moses' life changed forever. Exodus 3:1-2 describes the moment. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. Intrigued, Moses approached. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses," and Moses said, "Here I am." Exodus 3:4. This was no ordinary encounter. It was a direct call from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God declared, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them. And now I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Exodus 3:7-10. Moses' doubts and God's reassurance. Moses was overwhelmed by the task. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Exodus 3:11. His self-doubt mirrored the fear and inadequacy many of us feel when faced with a divine calling. But God reassured him, "I will be with you." Exodus 3:12. When Moses worried that the Israelites wouldn't believe him, God equipped him with miraculous signs: a staff that turned into a serpent, a hand that became leprous and then healed, and water from the Nile that would turn to blood. Exodus 4:1-9. Even with these assurances, Moses hesitated, citing his lack of eloquence. "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." Exodus 4:10. God responded, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." Exodus 4:11-12. Finally, Moses accepted the call, with God appointing his brother Aaron as his spokesperson. Exodus 4:14-16. Together, they would confront Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites, obedience and the journey back to Egypt. Exodus 4:20 captures this turning point. So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started back to Egypt. And he took the staff of God in his hand. The staff, an ordinary shepherd's tool, became a symbol of God's power. With every step toward Egypt, Moses demonstrated obedience, trusting that God would fulfill his promises. God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Moses' journey from Pharaoh's court to the wilderness and back to Egypt reminds us that God's plans often defy human understanding. His calling was not based on Moses' qualifications, but on God's power to work through him. As we reflect on Moses' story, we are reminded that no past mistake or personal limitation can hinder God's purpose. Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh, the most powerful man in Egypt, armed with nothing but a divine mandate and a shepherd's staff. The court of Pharaoh was a place of grandeur, filled with ornate carvings, towering pillars, and the weight of authority. Pharaoh himself, seated on a golden throne, regarded the two brothers with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. To him they were merely representatives of a lowly enslaved people. Yet as Exodus 5:1 records, Moses spoke with boldness. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's response was swift and dismissive. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Exodus 5:2. To Pharaoh, the God of the Hebrews was irrelevant, a powerless deity of an enslaved people. His heart was hardened, his arrogance blinding him to the power of the one who had sent Moses. Instead of heeding their request, Pharaoh increased the burden on the Israelites, forcing them to gather their own straw for bricks while maintaining their daily quotas. The people's suffering deepened, and they turned on Moses, accusing him of making their lives worse. Moses, discouraged, cried out to God, "Why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." Exodus 5:22-23. But God reassured him with a powerful promise. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country." Exodus 6:1. Strengthened by God's assurance, Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh. This time they performed the first of many signs. Aaron's staff transformed into a serpent before Pharaoh's eyes. But Pharaoh's magicians, using their own sorcery, replicated the feat, and Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Yet even in this display of resistance, God's power was evident. Aaron's serpent swallowed the others, a subtle yet undeniable foreshadowing of the greater victories to come. The confrontation had only begun. God commanded Moses to warn Pharaoh of what would follow if he continued to refuse his command. The first plague struck as Moses, following God's instructions, raised his staff over the waters of the Nile. The river, the lifeblood of Egypt, turned to blood. Fish died, the waters reeked, and the people were left to dig for drinking water. Yet Pharaoh's magicians imitated the miracle, and his heart grew harder still. 7 days passed, and Pharaoh's defiance remained unshaken. The second plague descended, frogs. They swarmed the land, entering homes, kitchens, and even Pharaoh's palace. The magicians again replicated the phenomenon, but it brought no relief. Overwhelmed by the nuisance, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, promising to let the Israelites go if the frogs were removed. Moses prayed, and the frogs died out, but Pharaoh's promise proved empty. He reneged on his word, hardening his heart once more. Plague after plague followed, each one demonstrating the futility of Pharaoh's resistance. Gnats arose from the dust of the ground, a feat the magicians could not replicate, prompting them to exclaim, "This is the finger of God." Exodus 8:19. Yet Pharaoh remained unmoved. Swarms of flies descended, devastating livestock, crops, and the Egyptian sense of order. Disease struck their animals, boils afflicted their bodies, and hail destroyed their fields. At each step Pharaoh wavered, calling for Moses to plead for relief, only to harden his heart again once the plague was lifted. By the time locusts covered the land, devouring every green plant and leaving Egypt desolate, even Pharaoh's officials began to plead with him. "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Exodus 10:7. But Pharaoh's pride was unyielding. He continued to bargain, offering to let only the men go or to impose conditions that fell short of God's command. Each compromise was rejected, for God's demand was clear. All of Israel, men, women, children, and livestock, must go. The 9th plague brought a darkness that could be felt, covering Egypt for 3 days. This was not a natural phenomenon, but a divine act, a complete blotting out of the sun, which the Egyptians worshipped as a god. Yet even this display of power failed to break Pharaoh's resolve. His heart was as hard as the stone idols he worshipped. Throughout these plagues, God's purpose became increasingly clear. Exodus 9:16 reveals, "But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." Pharaoh's defiance served only to magnify God's sovereignty, demonstrating that no earthly power could stand against him. Moses and Aaron, once hesitant and unsure, now stood as unwavering instruments of God's will. With each confrontation, they grew in faith and boldness, trusting that God's promises would be fulfilled. Yet the final and most devastating plague was still to come, a plague that would shatter Pharaoh's pride and force his hand. Egypt would never be the same. The plagues that struck Egypt were more than natural disasters. They were a deliberate demonstration of God's unmatched power, each one targeting the very foundations of Egyptian life, culture, and belief. Pharaoh, whose heart was hardened by pride and arrogance, stood as the symbol of resistance against God. Yet, with each act of divine judgment, it became increasingly clear that the God of the Hebrews was sovereign over all creation. The first plague came like a strike to the heart of Egypt. The Nile, the source of their life and prosperity, was turned into blood. Exodus 7:20-21 recounts, "Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water." The Nile was not just a river. It was the lifeblood of the nation and a symbol of fertility and sustenance. To see it transformed into a stinking flow of death sent a clear message. The gods of Egypt were powerless. Pharaoh's magicians managed to replicate this plague on a smaller scale, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. Yet, the people of Egypt began to feel the weight of what had happened. They dug around the Nile, desperately searching for drinkable water. 7 days passed, but Pharaoh's resolve remained unchanged. Then came the second plague, frogs in overwhelming numbers. They invaded homes, kitchens, bedrooms, and even Pharaoh's palace. Exodus 8:3-4 describes the scene vividly. The Nile will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace and your bedroom and onto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs. Frogs, which were associated with the goddess Heket, a symbol of fertility, now became a curse. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, promising to let the Israelites go if the frogs were removed. Moses prayed, and the frogs died out, but Pharaoh, true to his pattern, reneged on his word. The third plague came unannounced, gnats swarming from the dust of the ground. Unlike before, the magicians could not replicate this sign. They admitted to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." Exodus 8:19. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. The gnats were followed by flies, swarms that invaded every corner of Egyptian life. The fourth plague marked a turning point. While the Egyptians suffered under the flies, the Israelites in Goshen were spared. Exodus 8:22 records God's words, "But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land." The distinction between Egypt and Israel continued with the fifth plague, which struck down the livestock of the Egyptians. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats all perished, devastating the agricultural backbone of the nation. Yet not a single animal belonging to the Israelites was harmed. Even this did not move Pharaoh. The sixth plague brought boils, painful sores that afflicted both people and animals. This time, Pharaoh's magicians were not only unable to replicate the miracle, they were struck down by the boils themselves. Exodus 9:11 notes, "The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and on all the Egyptians. Pharaoh, however, remained defiant." The seventh plague was a warning to Pharaoh and his officials. God, speaking through Moses, declared, "By now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." Exodus 9:15-16. When Moses raised his staff, hail rained down on Egypt, mixed with fire. It struck down crops, trees, and livestock in the fields. Those who heeded Moses' warning and sheltered their servants and animals were spared, but those who ignored it suffered great loss. Pharaoh again called for Moses, admitting his sin, but once the hail stopped, he returned to his stubborn ways. Next came locusts, sweeping across the land and devouring everything left by the hail. Egypt's officials, desperate for relief, pleaded with Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. "Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Exodus 10:7. But Pharaoh's pride was unyielding. He attempted to bargain, allowing only the men to leave, but Moses refused. The plague came, leaving Egypt barren. The ninth plague brought darkness, a thick, impenetrable darkness that lasted for 3 days. This was no ordinary darkness. It symbolized the defeat of Ra, the sun god, one of Egypt's most powerful deities. While the Egyptians were enveloped in darkness, the Israelites had light in their dwellings. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained unyielding. He angrily ordered Moses to leave, declaring, "The day you see my face, you will die." Exodus 10:28. Moses responded with a chilling prophecy. "You are right. I will never see your face again." Exodus 10:29. Each plague struck at the heart of Egyptian life and worship, systematically dismantling their pantheon of gods. The Nile, frogs, livestock, and even the sun itself, all were shown to be under the authority of the one true God. Yet Pharaoh's hardened heart remained a testament to the human capacity for pride and rebellion. Through these plagues, God demonstrated his power, not just to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but to all who would hear of these events. Exodus 9:16 declares, "But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." Even in judgment, God's ultimate purpose was redemption, for His people and for the world. But the final plague, the most devastating of all, was yet to come. It would break Pharaoh's will and mark the beginning of Israel's journey to freedom. The stage was set for the final and most devastating plague, a plague that would not only shatter Pharaoh's pride but also bring Egypt to its knees. Despite the unimaginable suffering inflicted by the previous 9 plagues, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Each time he wavered, he returned to defiance, but this final act of judgment would leave no room for resistance. God spoke to Moses with solemnity and clarity, detailing what was to come. Exodus 11:1-2 records, "Now the Lord had said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here, and when he does, he will drive you out completely." This plague would strike at the very core of Egypt, their future, their pride, and their sense of invincibility. Moses, obeying God's instructions, delivered a dire warning to Pharaoh. "This is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the female slave who is at her hand mill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well." Exodus 11:4-5. The death of the firstborn would be the ultimate blow, demonstrating that even Pharaoh, considered a god by his people, was powerless to protect his own household. Pharaoh's response was not recorded in words, but in silence, a silence that spoke volumes of his stubbornness. He had defied the God of the Hebrews time and time again, believing himself to be untouchable. But the weight of his decisions was about to fall upon him with devastating finality. Meanwhile, God gave Moses instructions for the Israelites to prepare for this momentous night. This preparation became the foundation of the Passover, a sacred observance that would commemorate their deliverance for generations to come. Exodus 12:3-7 outlines the specifics. "Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. The lamb's blood painted on the door frames would serve as a sign for the Lord to pass over their homes, sparing the Israelites from the coming judgment." The instructions were detailed, and the people obeyed with reverence, knowing that their obedience would mean the difference between life and death. As midnight approached, a tense silence settled over Egypt. The Israelites, huddled in their homes, ate the Passover meal in haste as God had commanded. "Eat it in haste, it is the Lord's Passover." Exodus 12:11. They were dressed and ready to leave at a moment's notice, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Then, at the appointed time, judgment struck. Exodus 12:29-30 recounts the harrowing scene. "At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead." The grief that swept through Egypt was unparalleled. The gods they had trusted to protect them had failed. The Pharaoh, who had stood as a symbol of divine power, was now broken, mourning the loss of his own firstborn son. It was a moment of undeniable defeat, a clear demonstration that the God of Israel was supreme over all. In his anguish, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron during the night and finally relented. "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." Exodus 12:31-32. His words, spoken in desperation, were a complete reversal of his earlier defiance. Pharaoh, the ruler of the most powerful nation on earth, had been brought low by the hand of God. The Egyptians, too, urged the Israelites to leave, fearful that further delays might bring even greater calamity. Exodus 12:33 notes, "The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die." They gave the Israelites silver, gold, and clothing, fulfilling the promise God had made earlier that his people would not leave empty-handed. Exodus 12:35-36. As the Israelites departed, their numbers swelled to over 600,000 men, not including women and children. It was a nation on the move, carrying with them the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. The Exodus marked not only their physical liberation, but also the triumph of God's covenant faithfulness. Yet even as the Israelites left Egypt in haste, Pharaoh's hardened heart was not fully softened. His defeat did not translate to surrender. His grief soon gave way to anger, and he would muster his army to pursue them, leading to the dramatic climax at the Red Sea. But for now, in this moment, the Israelites stood at the threshold of freedom, delivered by the hand of God. The story of Pharaoh's hardened heart serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of pride and rebellion against God. Despite countless opportunities to repent, Pharaoh chose to resist, leading to the ultimate destruction of his land and his people. Yet even in judgment, God's purpose was redemptive, showcasing his power and establishing his name as the one true God over all the earth. The night of the first Passover was unlike any other in history, a night that forever marked the transition from bondage to freedom for the Israelites. In obedience to God's instructions, each family had chosen a spotless lamb, cared for it, and prepared it as a sacrifice. Its blood, painted on the doorframes of their homes, served as the sign of their faith and the protection of their firstborn from the final plague. This act of obedience, though simple, carried profound significance. It was a declaration of trust in the God who had promised to deliver them. Inside the homes of the Israelites, the mood was tense, yet reverent. The aroma of roasted lamb filled the air as families gathered to eat the meal in haste, dressed and ready to leave at a moment's notice. They ate bitter herbs, a reminder of their years of suffering in Egypt, and unleavened bread, symbolizing the urgency of their departure. The instructions were clear. This meal was not just sustenance, it was a sacred act, one that would be commemorated by generations to come. Exodus 12:14 records, "This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance." While the Israelites ate in preparation, the angel of the Lord moved through Egypt, bringing the 10th and final plague. At midnight, the cries of anguish began, spreading from house to house. The firstborn of every Egyptian household perished. From the palace of Pharaoh to the humblest of homes, even the firstborn of the livestock were struck down. Exodus 12:30 describes the scene vividly. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. The death of the firstborn was not just a physical loss. It was a direct challenge to the spiritual foundation of Egypt. Pharaoh, considered a living god, was powerless to save his own heir. The gods of Egypt, worshipped and revered, were exposed as impotent against the power of the God of Israel. This was the culmination of God's judgment, not only on Pharaoh's tyranny, but on the false deities that Egypt trusted for protection and provision. Pharaoh, broken and grieving, summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. His words were urgent and desperate. "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." Exodus 12:31-32. The once defiant ruler now begged for their departure, acknowledging the supremacy of the God he had tried to defy. The Egyptians too urged the Israelites to leave quickly. They were terrified, convinced that further delay would bring even greater destruction. Exodus 12:33 recounts, "The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die." In their haste, the Israelites packed their belongings and gathered their families. They took with them the unleavened bread dough wrapped in cloth, as they had no time to let it rise. As God had foretold, they also asked the Egyptians for silver, gold, and clothing. The Egyptians, eager to see them leave, gave generously, fulfilling God's promise that his people would not leave empty-handed. The Israelites' departure was not a quiet or solitary event. It was a massive exodus of over 600,000 men, not including women and children. Families, livestock, and belongings formed a great procession, moving toward freedom under the watchful guidance of Moses. This was the fulfillment of a promise made centuries earlier to Abraham, that his descendants would be freed from oppression and would inherit a land of their own. Genesis 15:14 had declared, "But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions." As the Israelites marched, they carried with them more than their belongings. They carried the bones of Joseph, who had long ago instructed his descendants to bring his remains out of Egypt. Exodus 13:19 notes, "Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, 'God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place.'" This act symbolized the continuity of God's promises from one generation to the next. Though the path ahead was uncertain, the Israelites moved forward in faith, guided by the visible presence of God. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud, and by night in a pillar of fire. Exodus 13:21-22 describes this extraordinary provision. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. This divine guidance reassured the Israelites that they were not alone. God himself was leading them toward the fulfillment of his promises. Yet, even as they celebrated their newfound freedom, the Israelites were about to face one of their greatest tests. Pharaoh, though humbled, was not finished. His grief and despair would soon give way to anger and vengeance, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic and faith-testing moments in their journey: the crossing of the Red Sea. As dawn broke over Egypt, the land was marked by an eerie silence. The cries of grief that had filled the night were now replaced by the hurried preparations of the Israelites. After generations of bondage, the moment they had longed for had finally arrived. The Israelites were leaving Egypt, not as individuals or scattered families, but as a unified nation under God's guidance. The Exodus was an extraordinary sight. Over 600,000 men, accompanied by women, children, and livestock, formed a vast multitude moving out of the land of their oppression. Exodus 12:37-38 records, the Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. Among them were not only the descendants of Jacob, but also others who had witnessed the plagues and recognized the power of the God of Israel. They too joined the journey, seeking freedom and hope. Though they left in haste, the departure was not chaotic. God had instructed them to prepare for this moment. The unleavened bread they carried symbolized their readiness to move quickly, leaving behind the leaven of Egypt. Exodus 12:39 describes, "With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread." The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. The unleavened bread, later celebrated in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, became a lasting reminder of their deliverance. As they moved forward, Moses led them with confidence, not in his own abilities, but in the assurance of God's promises. This was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a journey to the land God had sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Exodus 13:5 records God's promise, When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites, the land he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you are to observe this ceremony in this month. The journey was as much about shaping the identity of a people as it was about reaching a physical destination. Among the possessions they carried was a sacred and symbolic item, the bones of Joseph. Exodus 13:19 recounts, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. Joseph's bones were a tangible link to their history, a reminder that God's promises were not confined to a single generation but spanned across time. As they departed, the Israelites were guided by an unmistakable sign of God's presence. During the day, a pillar of cloud led the way, and at night, a pillar of fire illuminated their path. Exodus 13:21-22 describes this miraculous guidance. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. These pillars were not only practical but deeply symbolic, a visible reminder that God was with them in every step of their journey. Despite the joy of their departure, not all was resolved. Pharaoh, though broken by grief, began to regret his decision. Exodus 14:5 reveals his change of heart. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." His regret turned to fury, and he assembled his army, the most powerful military force of its time, to pursue the Israelites. Chariots rumbled through the streets of Egypt as Pharaoh's forces prepared to chase the people he had once enslaved. The Israelites, unaware of the danger closing in behind them, continued their journey, following the pillars of cloud and fire. Their route, however, was not a direct one. God led them in a way that seemed unconventional, taking them toward the Red Sea rather than the land of the Philistines. Exodus 13:17-18 explains this divine strategy. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. This route, though longer, was a path of faith, designed to teach the Israelites dependence on God rather than their own strength. As they approached the Red Sea, the vast waters stretched before them, an impassable barrier. It was a moment of testing, one that would reveal their trust or lack thereof in the God who had delivered them. And yet, even in this moment, God's plan was unfolding. Behind them, Pharaoh's army drew closer, a looming threat that seemed to erase the triumph of their departure. Exodus 14:9 describes the scene. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. The people, seeing the dust of Pharaoh's approaching army, were overcome with fear. They cried out to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt?" Exodus 14:11. Their cries reflected their uncertainty, their struggle to trust the God who had already demonstrated his power. Yet even in their fear, God was preparing to display his glory in a way that would forever mark their identity as his chosen people. The Israelites stood trapped between the waters of the Red Sea and the thunderous approach of Pharaoh's army. Behind them, the ground trembled with the sound of horses' hooves and the rumble of chariot wheels. Before them, the seemingly impassable expanse of the sea stretched out, cutting off any path to safety. It was a moment of despair, and the people's fear overwhelmed them. They cried out to Moses, accusing him of leading them to their deaths. "It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Exodus 14:12. Their faith, shaken by the sight of their pursuers, faltered. Moses, however, stood firm. His response was not one of panic, but of unwavering trust in God's power. He addressed the people with words of courage and reassurance. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:13-14. His words, spoken in the face of fear, pointed the Israelites back to the God who had delivered them from Egypt, reminding them that their deliverance did not depend on their strength, but on God's. In this critical moment, God instructed Moses to take action. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Exodus 14:15-16. What seemed impossible to human eyes, a path through the sea, was already within God's plan. His command was clear: move forward in faith. As Moses obeyed, an extraordinary miracle unfolded. The pillar of cloud that had been guiding the Israelites moved behind them, standing between the camp of Israel and the Egyptian army. Exodus 14:20 recounts, "Throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long." God himself shielded his people, giving them time to prepare for their journey through the sea. Moses stretched out his staff over the waters, and the sea began to part. A strong east wind blew throughout the night, driving back the waters and creating a pathway of dry land. Walls of water rose on either side, towering over the newly revealed path. Exodus 14:21-22 describes this awe-inspiring scene. "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. As the Israelites stepped onto the path, they walked not just with their feet, but with their faith." The sight of the divided waters and the dry ground beneath them was a testament to God's power and presence. Parents guided their children, shepherds led their flocks, and families carried their belongings, all moving toward freedom. Though the journey through the sea was daunting, it was also a moment of profound hope. Each step they took was an act of trust in the God who had made a way where there was none. Behind them, Pharaoh's army advanced, undeterred by the miracle unfolding before them. The Egyptians followed the Israelites into the sea, their chariots and horsemen charging down the same path, but their confidence would soon turn to chaos. Exodus 14:24-25 describes how God intervened. "During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, 'Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt.' When the last of the Israelites had safely crossed, God gave Moses one final command. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen.'" Exodus 14:26. As Moses obeyed, the waters returned to their place, crashing down upon the pursuing army. Exodus 14:28 captures the devastating end. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. The might of Egypt was utterly destroyed, not by human hands, but by the hand of God. On the other side of the sea, the Israelites stood in awe of what they had witnessed. They were no longer slaves, but a free people, delivered by their God. Exodus 14:31 recounts their response. "And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant." Their fear of Pharaoh was replaced by reverence for the God who had saved them. In their joy and gratitude, the Israelites lifted their voices in praise. Exodus 15 records the Song of the Sea, a hymn celebrating God's victory. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Exodus 15:2-3. Their song echoed across the desert, a declaration of freedom and faith in the God who had proven himself faithful. The crossing of the Red Sea was not just a miraculous event, it was a defining moment in the story of God's people. It demonstrated that faith in God could overcome the greatest obstacles and that his power was sufficient to deliver his people from any enemy. For generations to come, the story of the sea would be retold as a reminder of God's faithfulness, his power, and his unwavering commitment to his covenant. The wilderness stretched endlessly before the Israelites, its barren landscape offering no sign of food or water. Though they had witnessed the miraculous power of God at the Red Sea, their faith wavered in the face of scarcity. As the initial excitement of their freedom gave way to the harsh realities of desert life, the people began to grumble against Moses and Aaron. They said, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Exodus 16:3. Their words reflected not just hunger, but a deeper struggle to trust in God's provision. God, however, responded to their complaints with grace rather than judgment. He made a promise to provide for his people in a way that would not only meet their physical needs, but also teach them to rely on him. Exodus 16:4 records his words to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions." This bread from heaven, later called manna, was unlike anything the Israelites had ever seen. It appeared each morning as a fine, flaky substance covering the ground, and when the Israelites saw it for the first time, they asked, "What is it?" Which is exactly what the word manna means. Exodus 16:15. Moses explained that this was the bread God had provided for them to eat. Each family was to gather only what they needed for the day, a clear demonstration that their sustenance depended on daily obedience and trust. Any attempt to hoard the manna resulted in spoiled and maggot-infested food by the next morning, except for the sixth day, when they were instructed to gather a double portion in preparation for the Sabbath. This rhythm of provision and rest reinforced the idea that God was not only their provider, but also their source of rest and sanctification. The manna was a tangible reminder of God's faithfulness, but it wasn't the only miracle of provision in the wilderness. As they traveled further, they encountered another critical challenge: the lack of water. In the desert, the intense heat and dry conditions made water a matter of survival. Once again, the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Exodus 17:3. Their complaints revealed not just their physical desperation, but their ongoing struggle to believe that God would sustain them. In response to their cries, God instructed Moses to take his staff, the same staff that had parted the Red Sea, and strike a rock at Horeb. Exodus 17:6 describes what happened next. "I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." When Moses struck the rock, fresh water flowed out, quenching the thirst of the entire nation. This miraculous provision underscored God's ability to meet their needs in ways that defied natural expectations. The Apostle Paul would later reflect on this event in 1 Corinthians 10:4, describing the rock as a symbol of Christ, the spiritual source of living water. Despite these miracles, the wilderness journey was marked by a cycle of human frailty and divine faithfulness. Each time the Israelites faced a new challenge, their faith faltered, and each time God demonstrated his provision in ways that affirmed his presence among them. The manna and the water from the rock were not just acts of physical sustenance, but profound signs that God was shaping his people, teaching them to trust him in every circumstance. Yet the lessons of the wilderness were not just about provision, they were about dependence. In Egypt, the Israelites had relied on their oppressors for their food, even if it came at the cost of their freedom. In the wilderness, God was teaching them a new way of life, one in which they depended entirely on him for their daily bread. Deuteronomy 8:3 later reflected on this period, saying, "He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." This period in the wilderness also revealed the depth of God's patience. Though the Israelites grumbled and doubted, he continued to provide for them, shaping them into a nation that would bear his name. The manna would sustain them for the entire 40 years of their wandering, ceasing only when they entered the promised land. Joshua 5:12. This continuity of provision served as a daily reminder of God's faithfulness, even when their faith was weak. In these moments of provision, the Israelites were being prepared for something greater. The wilderness was not just a place of testing, but a place of transformation. It was here that they learned who God was, a provider, a sustainer, and a faithful covenant keeper. The manna and the water from the rock were just the beginning of the ways God would reveal himself to his people, drawing them closer to him as they journeyed toward the fulfillment of his promises. After weeks of wandering through the wilderness, the Israelites arrived at the base of Mount Sinai. This was no ordinary stop on their journey. It was a divine appointment. God had chosen this mountain as the place where he would formally establish his covenant with his people. Exodus 19:3-4 recounts how God spoke to Moses, saying, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." The arrival at Sinai marked a transition from deliverance to dedication, as God prepared to shape the Israelites into a holy nation. Moses ascended the mountain to meet with God, leaving the people camped below. There, God declared his intentions. "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Exodus 19:5-6. These words revealed the heart of God's plan. The Israelites were not just freed from Egypt to wander aimlessly, they were chosen for a purpose. They were to be his representatives on earth, a people set apart to reflect his holiness. Moses returned to the camp and conveyed God's message to the people, and they responded with one voice, "We will do everything the Lord has said." Exodus 19:8. This pledge of obedience marked their commitment to the covenant, though they would soon discover the depth of its requirements. God instructed Moses to consecrate the people, having them wash their clothes and abstain from certain activities, as preparation for his presence. The mountain itself became a holy place, set apart with strict boundaries. Anyone who approached it without permission would be put to death, for the presence of God demanded reverence. On the third day, Mount Sinai was enveloped in smoke and fire. Thunder rumbled, lightning flashed, and a loud trumpet blast echoed through the air, causing the people to tremble. Exodus 19:18-19 describes the scene. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. This awe-inspiring display was a manifestation of God's majesty, a reminder that he was not like the false gods of Egypt, but the creator of heaven and earth. It was in this setting that God delivered the 10 Commandments, the foundation of his covenant with Israel. These commandments recorded in Exodus 20 began with a declaration of his identity and authority. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Exodus 22. The commandments outlined a moral and spiritual framework that would guide the Israelites in their relationship with God and with one another. They included instructions to worship God alone, to honor the Sabbath, to respect parents, and to avoid murder, theft, adultery, false testimony, and covetousness. These were not arbitrary rules, but expressions of God's character and his desire for his people to reflect his holiness. As the commandments were spoken, the people stood in fear, overwhelmed by the presence of God. They pleaded with Moses, saying, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Exodus 20:19. Their reaction revealed the chasm between sinful humanity and a holy God. Yet even in their fear, God's purpose was clear. As Moses explained, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." Exodus 20:20. Moses once again ascended Mount Sinai, this time to receive the commandments written on stone tablets. For 40 days and nights he remained on the mountain, communing with God and receiving detailed instructions for the construction of the tabernacle and the establishment of the priesthood. These instructions underscored the covenant's depth, extending beyond the 10 Commandments to encompass every aspect of Israelite life. God's desire was not just to dwell among his people, but to be central to their worship and daily existence. The covenant at Mount Sinai was a turning point in the story of the Israelites. It established their identity as God's chosen people and set them apart from the nations around them. However, it also revealed their need for grace. Even as God gave them his laws, the Israelites struggled to live up to his standards. The commandments were not just rules to follow. They were a reflection of God's holiness and a call to trust him completely. This moment at Sinai would be remembered for generations. Deuteronomy 4:33-34 later reflected on the significance of this event. Has any other people heard the voice of God speaking out of fire, as you have and lived? Has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation? By testings, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds, like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes. The giving of the law was a unique and unparalleled event, one that marked Israel as God's treasured possession. The commandments given at Sinai were not just for the Israelites, but for all who would come to know the God of Israel. They pointed to a deeper truth that God desires relationship, not just rule following, and that his laws are an expression of his love and holiness. Though the Israelites would struggle to uphold the covenant, the God who had called them remained faithful, guiding them step by step toward his ultimate purpose. While Moses remained on Mount Sinai, enveloped in God's presence for 40 days and nights, the Israelites below grew restless. They had witnessed God's mighty acts of deliverance and heard his voice thunder from the mountain. Yet their faith faltered in Moses' prolonged absence. Fear and doubt crept into their hearts, and they began to question whether Moses would ever return. In their impatience, they sought a tangible representation of God, something they could see and touch. Exodus 32:1 describes their demand to Aaron, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron, rather than standing firm in faith, succumbed to their demands. He instructed the people to bring their gold jewelry, the very treasures they had received from the Egyptians during their exodus. Melting the gold, Aaron crafted it into the image of a calf, a common symbol of strength and fertility in the ancient Near East. He then declared, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Exodus 32:4. The people, eager to worship, offered sacrifices and indulged in revelry, turning their backs on the God who had delivered them. This act of idolatry was a profound betrayal. The covenant they had just entered with God explicitly forbade the worship of other gods or the creation of graven images. Exodus 24:5 had commanded, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." Yet in their impatience and lack of trust, the Israelites broke this foundational commandment. High on Mount Sinai, God informed Moses of the people's actions. His anger burned against them, and he declared his intention to destroy them and start anew with Moses. Exodus 32:9-10 records his words, "I have seen these people, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." But Moses, demonstrating the heart of an intercessor, pleaded with God to relent. He appealed to God's reputation among the nations and his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people." Exodus 32:12. Moved by Moses' prayer, God relented from bringing immediate destruction upon the Israelites. However, the consequences of their sin would still be severe. Moses descended the mountain, carrying the stone tablets inscribed with the commandments of God. As he approached the camp and saw the golden calf and the revelry surrounding it, his anger burned hot. In a dramatic act of judgment, he threw the tablets to the ground, shattering them at the foot of the mountain. This symbolic act reflected the breaking of the covenant by the people's sin. Moses confronted Aaron, demanding an explanation. Aaron's response revealed not only his guilt, but also his attempt to shift blame. "Do not be angry, my lord," he said. "You know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, 'Make us gods who will go before us.' So I told them, 'Whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off.' Then they gave me the gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Exodus 32:22-24. Aaron's excuse, both implausible and irresponsible, underscored his failure as a leader in Moses' absence. Moses took decisive action to purge the camp of idolatry. He ground the golden calf into powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it, a bitter reminder of their sin. He then stood at the camp's entrance and called for those who remained loyal to the Lord. The Levites answered his call, and under Moses' direction they carried out God's judgment on the unrepentant, resulting in the loss of about 3,000 lives that day. Exodus 32:26-28. Though the immediate crisis was quelled, the consequences of the golden calf incident extended beyond the loss of life. Moses once again ascended Mount Sinai to plead for God's forgiveness on behalf of the people. His prayer was bold and selfless. "God, but now please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Exodus 32:32. God responded with both justice and mercy. He declared that those who had sinned against him would be held accountable, but he also reaffirmed his commitment to lead his people to the Promised Land. The golden calf incident was a sobering reminder of the Israelites' frailty and their tendency to revert to old ways of thinking. Despite experiencing God's miraculous deliverance and entering into a covenant with him, they quickly turned to idolatry when faced with uncertainty. This event highlighted their need for constant guidance and grace, a truth that resonates with all humanity. God's response to their sin also revealed his character. While he is a God of justice who cannot tolerate sin, he is also a God of mercy who responds to repentance and intercession. The shattered tablets of the covenant were soon replaced with new ones, as God instructed Moses to carve another set. This act symbolized not only the restoration of the covenant, but also God's willingness to forgive and renew his relationship with his people. The golden calf episode stands as a cautionary tale, warning against the dangers of impatience, idolatry, and misplaced trust. Yet it also points to the hope of restoration and the steadfastness of God's love. Though the Israelites had failed, God's plan for them endured. His faithfulness would not be shaken even by their greatest mistakes. Following the dramatic events of the golden calf, the Israelites' journey through the wilderness took on a renewed focus. Despite their failure, God reaffirmed His covenant with His people and continued to guide them toward their ultimate destiny. Central to this covenant was the construction of the tabernacle, a physical structure that would serve as God's dwelling place among His people. The tabernacle was more than a tent. It was a profound symbol of God's desire to be present with His people and to lead them into a deeper relationship with Him. The instructions for building the tabernacle were given directly by God to Moses during his time on Mount Sinai. In Exodus 25:8, God declared, "Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them." This statement encapsulated the heart of God's intention to be near His people, not as a distant deity, but as an ever-present guide and protector. The design of the tabernacle was intricate and detailed, reflecting the holiness of God and the reverence He required. Every element, from the materials used to the dimensions specified, carried spiritual significance. The construction of the tabernacle began with the gathering of materials. God commanded Moses to invite the people to contribute offerings, saying, "From what you have, take an offering for the Lord. Everyone who is willing is to bring to the Lord an offering of gold, silver, and bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and fine linen, goat hair, ram skins dyed red, and another type of durable leather, acacia wood, olive oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil and for the fragrant incense, and onyx stones and other gems to be mounted on the ephod and breastpiece." Exodus 35:5-9. The people responded with extraordinary generosity, bringing so much that Moses eventually had to tell them to stop. This outpouring of resources reflected their renewed commitment to God after the golden calf incident. The tabernacle was designed as a portable structure, enabling the Israelites to carry it with them as they traveled. Its layout included three main sections: the outer court, the holy place, and the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. The outer court was open to all Israelites and contained the bronze altar for sacrifices and the bronze basin for ceremonial washing. These elements symbolized purification and atonement, preparing the people to approach God. The holy place, accessible only to the priests, housed the table of showbread, the golden lampstand, and the altar of incense. Each item carried profound spiritual meaning. The table of showbread held 12 loaves of bread, representing the 12 tribes of Israel and God's provision for His people. The golden lampstand, crafted with branches resembling an almond tree, provided light, symbolizing God's guidance and presence. The altar of incense, placed before the veil leading to the most holy place, represented the prayers of the people rising to God. At the heart of the tabernacle was the most holy place, separated from the holy place by a thick veil. Inside this sacred space was the Ark of the Covenant, a wooden chest overlaid with gold. The Ark contained the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod that budded, and a jar of manna, reminders of God's covenant, leadership, and provision. The Ark's cover, known as the mercy seat, was flanked by 2 golden cherubim with their wings outstretched. It was here above the mercy seat that God's presence would dwell in a visible manifestation of His glory. Exodus 25:22 describes this sacred meeting place. There, above the cover between the 2 cherubim that are over the Ark of the Covenant law, I will meet with you and give you all my commands for the Israelites. The construction of the tabernacle was a communal effort involving skilled artisans, craftsmen, and laborers. God specifically chose Bezalel and Oholiab, filling them with His Spirit to enable them to execute the intricate designs with precision and artistry. Exodus 35:31-32 says, "And He has filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze." Their work reflected the principle that all gifts and talents were to be used for God's glory. When the tabernacle was finally completed, it was dedicated to the Lord in a solemn ceremony. Exodus 40:34-35 describes the moment when God's presence filled the structure. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This event confirmed that God had accepted their offering and would dwell among his people as promised. The tabernacle became the center of Israel's worship and spiritual life. It reminded the people of God's holiness and their need for atonement, as well as his desire to be close to them. The sacrificial system, administered by the priests, pointed to the seriousness of sin and the necessity of a mediator. Yet even in its grandeur, the tabernacle was a temporary structure, a foreshadowing of something greater. Centuries later, the Apostle John would declare, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." John 1:14. The Greek word for dwelling is closely tied to the concept of the tabernacle, emphasizing that Jesus Christ fulfilled the tabernacle's purpose by bringing God's presence directly to humanity. For the Israelites in the wilderness, the tabernacle was a tangible reminder of God's faithfulness and his desire to be with them. It was not merely a building, but a symbol of relationship, a God who did not abandon his people but walked with them, even in their wandering. Through the tabernacle, God's glory was made visible, and his covenant promises were reaffirmed, shaping the identity of his chosen people. As the Israelites stood on the threshold of the promised land, the weight of their journey rested heavily upon Moses. For 40 years, he had led them through the wilderness, interceded on their behalf, and served as the mediator of God's covenant. Now, at the age of 120, Moses knew that his time as leader was coming to an end. Though he had longed to enter the land of promise, God had revealed to him that this honor would not be his. Instead, he was tasked with preparing the people to enter under the leadership of Joshua, his faithful assistant and God's chosen successor. Before his departure, Moses gathered the nation to deliver a series of farewell speeches recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. These speeches were not mere goodbyes. They were a call to faithfulness, a reminder of God's covenant, and a challenge to remain obedient as they stepped into a new chapter of their history. Moses began by recounting their journey, reminding them of God's faithfulness and provision. He spoke of the victories they had already experienced, such as their triumphs over Sihon and Og, kings of the Amorites, and emphasized that these victories were a foretaste of what God would accomplish in the land ahead. Moses' words were filled with both encouragement and warning. He urged the people to trust in God's power and to reject the idolatry that had plagued them in the past. "Be careful," he said, "that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." Deuteronomy 8:11-14. His warnings were rooted in a deep understanding of human nature, shaped by years of leading a people prone to forgetfulness and rebellion. Moses also emphasized the importance of the law which he had received from God on Mount Sinai. He instructed the Israelites to keep these commandments at the center of their lives, teaching them diligently to their children and engraving them on their hearts. "Take to heart all the words I have solemnly declared to you this day, so that you may command your children to obey carefully all the words of this law. They are not just idle words for you, they are your life." Deuteronomy 32:46-47. Moses understood that the key to the nation's success in the Promised Land was not military strength or political strategy, but faithfulness to God. One of Moses' most profound moments came when he addressed the transfer of leadership to Joshua. God had already chosen Joshua, a man of courage and faith, to lead the people after Moses' death. In the presence of the entire assembly, Moses formally commissioned Joshua, laying hands on him and charging him with the responsibility of guiding the nation. "Be strong and courageous," Moses declared. "Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you," at Deuteronomy 31:6. These words, spoken from one leader to the next, reflected Moses' confidence not in Joshua's abilities alone, but in God's unwavering presence with his people. The commissioning of Joshua was not just a practical necessity, it was a deeply spiritual act. By laying hands on Joshua, Moses symbolized the passing of authority and the continuation of God's plan. Numbers 27:18-20 recounts God's instructions for this act. "Take Joshua son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hand on him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly, and commission him in their presence. Give him some of your authority so the whole Israelite community will obey him." This moment affirmed Joshua as God's chosen leader, instilling confidence in the people as they prepared to follow him into uncharted territory. In his final days, Moses also took the time to bless each tribe of Israel, speaking prophetic words over their future. These blessings, recorded in Deuteronomy 33, were a reminder of God's faithfulness to each tribe and his promises to the nation as a whole. For example, to the tribe of Judah, Moses declared, "Hear, Lord, the cry of Judah, bring him to his people. With his own hands he defends his cause. Oh, be his help against his foes." Deuteronomy 33:7. To Levi, the tribe entrusted with the priesthood, Moses said, "Bless all his skills, Lord, and be pleased with the work of his hands." Deuteronomy 33:11. Each blessing reflected Moses' deep love for the people he had led and his trust in God's continued guidance. As Moses concluded his farewell, he directed the people's attention not to himself, but to the God who had called and sustained them. "There is no one like the God of Jeshurun, who rides across the heavens to help you and on the clouds in his majesty. The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms." Deuteronomy 33:26-27. His words were a final reminder that their success in the Promised Land would depend not on their own strength, but on their relationship with the God who had been with them every step of the way. Moses' life and leadership stand as one of the most profound examples of faith, perseverance, and humility in history. From his dramatic beginnings as an infant hidden in a basket to his final days overlooking the promised land he would not enter, Moses embodied the complexities of human frailty and divine purpose. His character and leadership were shaped by both triumphs and failures, making him a relatable yet extraordinary figure in the story of God's people. Moses' humility was one of his defining traits. Though he was raised in Pharaoh's palace and equipped with all the privileges of Egyptian royalty, he did not allow pride to overshadow his calling. Numbers 12:3 provides a striking description of Moses. "Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth." This humility was not innate, but forged through years of dependence on God, beginning with his exile in Midian. During those years as a shepherd, Moses learned to lead not with the arrogance of a prince, but with the patience and care of one entrusted with another's flock. Moses' reluctance to accept God's call at the burning bush reveals his deep awareness of his own limitations. When God commissioned him to deliver the Israelites from Egypt, Moses responded with hesitation, saying, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Exodus 3:11. This question reflected not only his self-doubt, but also his understanding of the enormity of the task. Yet, God's response was simple and profound. "I will be with you." Exodus 3:12. Throughout his life, Moses relied not on his own abilities, but on the assurance of God's presence. As a leader, Moses demonstrated unparalleled courage and persistence. He confronted Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, armed only with the staff in his hand and the words of the Lord. Time and again he stood before Pharaoh to deliver God's command, "Let my people go." Exodus 5:1. Despite Pharaoh's repeated refusals and the increasing hardships placed on the Israelites, Moses did not waver. His persistence was grounded in his trust that God would fulfill his promises. Yet Moses' leadership was not without challenges. The Israelites, despite witnessing miracles such as the parting of the Red Sea and the provision of manna, were a difficult and often rebellious people. They grumbled against Moses, accusing him of leading them to their deaths in the wilderness. At times, their complaints reached a breaking point for Moses. In one moment of exasperation, he cried out to God, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." Exodus 17:4. Despite his frustrations, Moses continually interceded on their behalf, pleading with God to show mercy rather than judgment. Moses' intercessory role was one of his most remarkable qualities. After the Israelites' sin with the golden calf, God declared his intention to destroy them and start anew with Moses. Instead of seizing the opportunity for personal glory, Moses pleaded for the people, appealing to God's covenant promises and reputation among the nations. "But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Exodus 32:32. This selflessness and willingness to stand in the gap for others highlighted Moses' deep love for the people he led, despite their flaws. Moses' character was also marked by obedience. Whether it was stretching out his staff over the Red Sea, striking the rock at Horeb for water, or ascending Mount Sinai to receive God's commandments, Moses consistently followed God's instructions. His obedience was not perfect. His striking of the rock at Meribah instead of speaking to it, as God commanded, ultimately cost him the opportunity to enter the Promised Land. Numbers 27-12. Yet even in his failure, Moses accepted God's judgment with humility, continuing to lead the people faithfully until the end of his life. Another defining aspect of Moses' leadership was his unwavering commitment to God's word. As the mediator of the covenant, Moses received the law and taught it to the Israelites, ensuring that they understood its significance. He reminded them repeatedly of the importance of obeying God's commands, emphasizing that their success in the Promised Land depended on their faithfulness. Deuteronomy 6:4-7 encapsulates this focus. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children." Moses' character also revealed his deep trust in God's sovereignty. He understood that his role was part of a larger plan, one that extended beyond his lifetime. Though he was denied entry into the Promised Land, Moses did not question God's decision. Instead, he continued to prepare the people and commission Joshua, ensuring a smooth transition of leadership. This willingness to accept God's plan, even when it meant personal disappointment, demonstrated Moses' ultimate loyalty to the Lord. As a leader, Moses left an indelible legacy. He was not perfect, but his life was a testament to the power of faith and obedience. Hebrews 11:24-27 reflects on Moses' choices. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. Moses' leadership continues to inspire, not because he was without flaws, but because he pointed others to God. His humility, courage, obedience, and intercession reveal a leader who understood his dependence on the Lord. Moses' story is a reminder that God often uses imperfect people to accomplish his perfect purposes, equipping them with his presence and power along the way. As the Israelites prepared to enter the Promised Land, Moses' journey approached its final chapter. For 40 years he had led them through trials, triumphs, and transformations. Now, standing at the plains of Moab, he looked upon the land he had longed to see but would never enter. God had made it clear that Moses would not cross the Jordan because of his disobedience at Meribah, where he struck the rock instead of speaking to it as commanded. Despite this consequence, Moses accepted God's decision with humility, devoting his final days to ensuring that the people were prepared for what lay ahead. Moses' last act of leadership was marked by profound wisdom and care. He gathered the people to deliver a series of final instructions and blessings recorded in Deuteronomy. His speeches were a reflection of his heart for the nation he had shepherded for so long. He reminded them of God's faithfulness throughout their journey, recounting the miraculous deliverance from Egypt, the provision of manna and water in the wilderness, and the victories over their enemies. These memories were not just history lessons, but calls to trust the God who had brought them this far. Moses also reiterated the covenant and the law, urging the Israelites to remain obedient to God's commands. He knew the challenges they would face in the Promised Land, the temptation to adopt the practices of the surrounding nations and the danger of forgetting the Lord in times of prosperity. "Be careful," he warned, "that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God." Deuteronomy 8:11-14. Moses spoke not only as a leader but as a father figure to the nation, offering words of encouragement and warning in equal measure. He charged them to choose life by loving the Lord and walking in his ways. "This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice and hold fast to him." Deuteronomy 30:19-20. These words captured the essence of Moses' leadership, a passionate desire for his people to remain faithful to the God who had chosen them. One of Moses' most significant final acts was the commissioning of Joshua. Recognizing that leadership was not about personal legacy, but about God's plan, Moses publicly affirmed Joshua as his successor. In the presence of the assembly, Moses laid hands on Joshua, transferring authority and blessing him with wisdom and strength. "The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." Deuteronomy 31:8. This act of commissioning was both practical and spiritual, ensuring continuity in leadership and reminding the people that God, not Moses, was the true leader of Israel. After blessing the tribes and addressing the nation, Moses ascended Mount Nebo as God had instructed. From its summit he gazed upon the promised land stretched out before him. Though he would not enter it, God allowed him to see the fulfillment of his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Deuteronomy 34:1-4 describes the scene. "Then the Lord said to him, 'This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it.'" Moses' final moments were spent in the presence of God. He died on Mount Nebo, and God himself buried him in Moab, in a place known to no one. This mysterious burial underscored the sacredness of Moses' life and death. Deuteronomy 34:5-6 records, "And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is." This act of divine burial was a fitting conclusion to a life wholly devoted to God's purposes. The Israelites mourned Moses' death for 30 days, recognizing the magnitude of his leadership and the loss of their faithful shepherd. Deuteronomy 34:10 reflects on his unique role in God's plan. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh, and to all his officials, and to his whole land. Moses was more than a leader. He was a mediator, a prophet, and a servant who walked closely with God. Though Moses' earthly journey ended on Mount Nebo, his legacy endured. He had faithfully passed the baton to Joshua, ensuring that the people were ready to move forward under God's guidance. More importantly, Moses' life pointed to a greater story of redemption. His role as a deliverer and mediator foreshadowed the ultimate deliverer, Jesus Christ, who would bring humanity into eternal freedom. For the Israelites, Moses' death marked the end of an era, but not the end of their story. His leadership had prepared them to enter the Promised Land, and his teachings continued to guide them for generations. Moses' final words, actions, and faithfulness left an indelible mark on God's people, reminding them that though leaders may come and go, God's promises endure forever. Moses' life is a story of faith, obedience, and perseverance, a journey that inspires us to trust in a higher purpose, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. From his miraculous rescue as a baby on the Nile to his final moments gazing at the Promised Land, Moses demonstrated what it means to walk in step with God's plan. His life was not without challenges. He faced doubts, failures, and hardships, yet his faith in God remained unshaken. In every season, Moses' story reminds us that God doesn't call the perfect, he perfects those he calls. One of the greatest lessons we can take from Moses is the power of faith. When faced with the impossible, Moses trusted in God's ability to make a way. Whether it was standing before Pharaoh with nothing but a staff, raising his hand over the Red Sea, or interceding for a rebellious nation, Moses acted in faith, knowing that God would fulfill his promises. Hebrews 11:27 highlights this faith. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. His example challenges us to trust in God's unseen hand, even when circumstances feel overwhelming. Moses' life also teaches us the importance of obedience. Time and again he followed God's instructions, even when they defied human logic. His willingness to obey allowed God to work miracles through him, demonstrating his power and faithfulness to an entire nation. Yet Moses' story also reveals the cost of disobedience. When he struck the rock at Meribah, instead of speaking to it, he was denied entry into the Promised Land. This moment of failure reminds us that while God is merciful, obedience matters deeply in our relationship with him. Finally, Moses' perseverance is a testament to his character. For 40 years he led a people who often doubted, complained, and rebelled. Yet Moses never gave up on them because he never gave up on the God who had called him. His endurance was rooted in his reliance on God's strength rather than his own. In moments of frustration, when he felt the weight of leadership pressing down, Moses turned to God for guidance, help, and reassurance. His perseverance encourages us to remain steadfast, trusting that God's plans are worth the struggle. The story of Moses is not just history, it's a legacy. His faithfulness laid the foundation for the nation of Israel and pointed to a greater deliverer to come, Jesus Christ. Like Moses, Jesus led his people out of bondage, not from physical slavery but from the chains of sin and death. Moses' life, with all its highs and lows, ultimately foreshadowed the redemption story that God was writing for all humanity. Today, Moses' story continues to impact millions, reminding us that God can use ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. It's a story of hope, redemption, and the transformative power of trusting in a higher calling. Whatever challenges you face, Moses' journey reminds us that God is always with us, equipping us for the tasks he sets before us and guiding us through every season of life. As we reflect on Moses' life, let's be inspired to live with the same faith, obedience, and perseverance. Let's choose to trust in God's plan even when it doesn't make sense. Let's step into the unknown with courage, knowing that the God who parted the Red Sea and provided manna in the wilderness is the same God who walks with us today. And let's remember that every step of faith we take is part of a greater story, one that brings glory to God and draws us closer to His purpose for our lives. Before we close, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Moses. If this story has inspired you, please support this channel by hitting the like button, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing. Your support helps us continue to share meaningful stories like this one with people all around the world. Let's take a moment to pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you for the life of Moses and the powerful lessons we can learn from his faith, obedience, and perseverance. Thank you for showing us through his story that you are a God who leads, provides, and fulfills your promises. Lord, I pray for everyone watching today. Whatever challenges they are facing, may they be reminded that you are with them, guiding them just as you guided Moses. Strengthen their faith, give them courage, and help them to trust in your higher purpose. Bless their lives, their families, and their journeys. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you once again for being part of this community. Together, let's continue to explore stories of faith and discover how God's Word can transform our lives. See you in the next video. Until then, take care, stay blessed, and trust in the God who leads us all.